All right. Hey, everybody. Let's see. Go. Things are happening. All right. I think we've got it. So hi, for everyone who might not know, my name is Nathan Smith. I am the digital programming coordinator here at the Central Arkansas Library System. It'd probably help if I was using my mic correctly. So thanks for coming. This is part 4 of the Excel course, which is, of course, Microsoft Excel Part 4, PivotTables, PivotCharts, and Lookup. So today we're going to wrap up the course, and we are going to talk about all of those things that I just said, and hopefully you will get a lot out of it. Before we dive in, just the usual quick preliminary things. Of course, if you have questions at any point, please just let me know. Don't worry about whether it's sort of a silly question or those sorts of things. That's not at all an issue for me. I would strongly prefer that you ask a question that's pretty easy to answer than that you don't ask a question that you have just because you're a little nervous that it might seem like a silly question. I am not here to judge. I'm here to help you learn useful things about technology. So if you're learning useful things about technology, then things are going great. And if I'm saying things that are confusing you and you're not understanding, and it's just kind of going in one ear and out the other, then we have a problem. So please let me know if we have a problem, so that way I can make sure that whatever questions you have get addressed, and that we can keep it rolling and have a great class and have you come away sort of having learned things that'll help you. So how do you do that? Well, if you are joining me here in Zoom, then it's pretty straightforward. Down at the bottom of your Zoom window, if you're on a computer, you should see a little speech bubble that says chat. Click on that chat speech bubble, and it'll pop the little chat option, the little chat panel right out, probably on the side of your screen, unless you're in full screen, in which case it'll be a separate little box. But regardless, you should see that the little chat panel and be able to fill in your question, type it in, just press enter, and you'll be good to go. If you are if you're joining me via Zoom on a mobile device, you can also ask questions there. That's pretty easy too. All you need to do is tap the middle of your screen, and you should see a little, a bunch of options pop up. And in the corner, you should see something that says more. Tap on that, and then tap the chat option in that menu, and you'll see it come, and you'll be able to type your questions in. If you're joining me on Facebook or YouTube, on Facebook, all you'll need to do is just put your question in the Facebook comments, just like you would on any other post. And if you are on YouTube, just look to my right, or to the right of me from your perspective, and you should see the live chat box, and you can type your question in there. Also, if you want to follow along, I'll go ahead and put the link to the example files for this particular session in the chat and in all of the other places. So please, if you want to follow along, please do. That's cals.link/excel-for-files. If you just want to watch this time and then go back and follow along later on, you're welcome to do that as well. We are live streaming on Facebook and YouTube, and so you can head to the Central Arkansas Library System YouTube channel or our Facebook page and find the video there and follow along on your second go around. So it's just whatever works for you. So let's go ahead and dive in. I am going to I'm going to mute myself, apparently accidentally. And let's see. I will, all right, go ahead and fire up the screen sharing. There we go. Okay, so we've got our, I've got the example file here in front of me, part4.xlsx. Again, you can get that from that link that I just sent in the chat and the comments and so forth. Whoops. Woo, things are happening today. So here's a little roadmap of what we're going to be doing. First, we're going to talk about tables. Then we're going to talk about pivot tables. Then we'll talk a little bit about pivot charts, which are little charts you can make from a table. And finally, we will talk about the VLOOKUP function, which is a really useful way that you can, that you can look stuff up in your workbook. So here we go. Let's go ahead and get rolling with tables. So tables are a really useful way to organize your information on your sheets. One of the things that can happen sometimes if you are in the midst of if you've got multiple sets of data, particularly multiple sets of data that you need to be able to see at the same time, that can be really tricky because you don't want to get your data mixed up, or if you had two sets of columns with different data sets in them, particularly if they're right next to each other, there's a chance that if you sort, you will end up scrambling the information in the other set of columns by sorting by a column in one set. So we want to avoid that. We want to make sure that we are our information stays separate and well organized and so forth. And sometimes there's a question of readability as well. If you've got a big long list of stuff, sometimes it's kind of hard to read because all those rows and columns start to sort of swim after a while, or you forget what column you're looking in, or if you have 6 different columns that all have numbers in them right together, then it may be hard to tell, like, okay, what's the first quarter numbers versus the third quarter numbers or whatever. So we're going to use, one way that we can help ourselves out with this is to use tables. And tables are a really useful thing for pivot tables as well, which we'll circle around to in a second. So on my first sheet, which is in this workbook, which is just called tables, what I'm going to do is come up here and I'm going to select cells A1 down to D24, A1 to D24. So I'll just hold in the middle of A1, hold my mouse down and drag until I get D24 selected as well. This is the first data set. There's 2 data sets here. There's Marvel movies up here and there's Star Wars movies down here. So what I want to do is I want to keep these 2 sets of data separate so that I can organize them the ways I want to. And I also want to, I also want to make sure that I am, I want to make sure they don't get mixed up, things like that. So I've got A1 to D24 selected. I'm going to come over to my, oops, I'm going to come over here and I can either click on the Home tab, Format as Table, and choose an option of how I want it to look. Or over here on the Insert tab, I can just click Table. And either way, it's going to take me to basically this. So it's a little dialog box here that says Create Table. Where's the data for your table? So you want to make sure this is $A, $1, colon, $D, $24. Just a reminder from either last week or a couple weeks ago, I forget, This A1 and D24 here, these are absolute references. That's why they have the dollar signs in front of them. The dollar signs basically tell Excel, these are the exact cells that I want. If this is copied and pasted somewhere else or things change, stick with these particular cells. And then I have the check mark here that says my table has headers. I do want to make sure that that's checked because, of course, if I look at the data set, there are headers here. There's a title, release date, director, writer. I'll click OK. And there we have it. So now I have a table here. I've got my top row looks a little bit different because it's my column headers rather than just being my the text and looking like a part of the data set with the rest of it. I now have, it's now in bold, it's white instead of black, and it's on this darker blue background. And you'll notice I have little drop downs here, which might look familiar from particularly part 1, where we talked about sort and filter. And when I click on these, sure enough, I can sort and filter the stuff here. Great. So, so tables are going to do a number of things. Also, another really useful thing that this is doing, you'll notice I mentioned readability before. Each row of my actual data it has this kind of zebra stripe effect, what we call banded rows. And so every other row is blue and every other row is white. And that makes it really helpful, particularly if you're reading it on paper, things like that, where there aren't as many cues that you're looking across on the same row. That gives you a nice solid visual cue that allows you to really easily read across the whole row. It looks nice when it's printed too, honestly. We have our table here. When I've got my selection inside of the table, you'll notice I've got a whole new tab up here, the Table Design tab. And there's a bunch of stuff going on in the Table Design tab. Part of the, one of the things we've got is our, up here, the table name. You'll notice it says table 1 there. That's kind of similar to when we named a cell the other week so that we could point to it kind of in place of using an absolute reference. You can also name a table instead of a range of cells, and that'll become really helpful here shortly. We've got a few other tools here, some of which we'll talk about a little later. If you wanted to remove the table functionality and just leave things as they are, but remove that table functionality, you can click Convert to Range. You've got slicers, which will kind of help you analyze data. And a whole bunch of style options over here. So you can change whether Excel recognizes a header row or not. You can add a total row if you're doing something mathematical there. The banded rows, of course, we talked about. You can also do banded columns. You can make the first column and last column, you can have them styled in special ways. And you can choose whether or not the little filter buttons up at the top, the little drop-down arrows that we talked about, will stay here. When I do this, you'll notice, or when I go up here, if I decide to sort this way, I'll go sort A to Z, and now it's sorted alphabetically by director. But you'll notice this hasn't been affected at all. If I had just gone in and used my sort and filter like we did the first week, what would have happened would be if I alphabetized from this column, then I would have gotten these directors and the movies that they worked on mixed up with these directors and the movies that they worked on. And I would have had director here alphabetized somewhere in the middle. And so using tables is going to help me keep this data separate. In fact, I'm going to come down here. I'm going to select A25 to D36, click Insert again, and click on Table one more time. I'll double check that this is correct. My table does have headers. I'll click OK. And now I have these, and I probably want to change the style because so that I can visually tell these are separate. That works. So now I can see these are two separate tables, and the data sets stay completely separate from each other. So I could organize these by director, but these by release date, or whatever the case may be, whatever is useful for you with a particular set of data, without worrying about these getting mixed up. Now, if I needed to add additional data to this list right here, then I'm going to have to come in and right click here, go to insert, and click table row below. That's going to add an additional row to the table. It is going to be styled in the correct way. It's going to push everything else down that's below it. And then I can put in, and just keep going. So you want to make sure you do that, even down here, if I were to add another item to this list, even if I put it here, thankfully Excel caught this, and you'll notice there's a little yellow border around here. There's a little lightning bolt that says autocorrect options. So it auto-corrected the fact that I was adding an extra row, that it figured I was adding an extra row to the table. If I wasn't, I could use this to either turn that off, or I could even just click undo up here, and that'll take care of it. Some versions of Excel are not going to do that. So if you're using a table, you want to make sure that you've expanded your table to accommodate that, or if you add something after the fact, you can go up to the table design tab and actually click resize table, so that you can get all of the data in there that you need. That's another option. Rather than adding additional rows one at a time or whatever, click resize table, select all the rows with the new data in it, and then you're good to go. Or select the rows where you're going to put the data and then add the data. So that's the main stuff about tables. They're really useful for organizing things and keeping visually keeping things straight, and also just making sure that you are making sure that you're doing that. Keeping your data sets separate from each other and keeping them accessible. One other thing that it does, though, up here at the top, one other thing that it does is it creates essentially an absolute reference to these little bits here, or to the data that's in my table, rather than filling in a standard sort of reference to a range like C4 to C100, like we did in back in part 2. Instead, I could fill in, instead I can just put table 2 in most cases, or table 1 up here, and that will also do the trick just fine. And in fact, when I expand the table, those additional rows of data will be incorporated right into the formula, so I don't have to do anything particularly special to make that happen. Speaking of which, let's go ahead and make one more table, and then we're going to use the strengths of tables to just sort of springboard right into a pivot table. I'm going to come down here where it says order list and click on that tab. And then once I'm over there, so this sheet has a lot of data on it. In fact, we have 1,000 fake orders from our fake company from various fake customers. So I want to turn all of this into a table, but we got to select it first. Let me show you a little trick to that, so that way we don't spend a ton of time on that. What I'm going to do is I'm going to make sure that cell A1 is selected here. Then I'm going to hold Control, or on a Mac, probably Command and Shift. While I'm holding Control and Shift, I'm going to press the right arrow key, and that is going to select all of the cells in this same row until the data stops and you get to an empty cell just like this. Excuse me. Then I'm going to hold control while pressing shift again. And this time I'll press down on the keyboard. And that is going to select all the data from on every row from my selection downward, again, until the data stops, until I get to that blank row, row 1002. So now I have all of that selected, A1 to N1001. By the way, if you do something wrong with that, that's totally normal. You know, it's a little tricky. If you end up down here, but none of your cells are selected, then just go ahead and click cell N1001 and reverse it. So do Control Shift or Command Shift, left arrow, Control Shift or Command Shift, up arrow. And that'll select it backwards, but it gets the same cells, and that's all we really need. So now that we've got that selected, again, what we can do is click Format as Table up here and select an option. I'll go with gray this time. And again, it's going to make sure that I've got my data selected. This is also another option. If you click Format as Table or you click Insert Table, it'll give you this dialog box, and you can manually type in $A, $1, colon, $N, $1001. You want to make sure you type it correctly, of course, but assuming you type it correctly, it should work just as well as selecting the cells. And then, of course, we want to make sure that my table has headers is, in fact, checked. I'll click OK. And now I have my table. Now, what I need to do, so I've got my table design tab here. I can either click Summarize with PivotTable here on the Table Design tab, or again, if I go over to the Insert tab, I can click PivotTable. Either way works, and it'll take me to the exact same dialog box here. It says Create Pivot Table. Choose the data that you want to analyze. Select a table or a range. In my case, since I have created 3 tables so far, this one is called Table 3, and so that's great. But you also have a few other options depending on your setup. You can connect what it calls an external data source. So that could be something like a Microsoft Access database, or it could be an online database of some sort that you have access to, things like that. Using that sort of stuff is beyond the scope of this course, but that's something you can do. You don't have to. You don't necessarily have to first bring the data into Excel in order to analyze it using a pivot table. But that's kind of the easiest way to go. The next section here is choose where you want the pivot table report to be placed, and I can choose either a new worksheet or an existing worksheet. If I choose an existing worksheet, in this case, there's already going to be data there. So I definitely do not want to choose an existing one. Now, if you created a new blank one and call it pivot table or whatever, then great, go ahead and select that one. But in most cases, new worksheet is going to be the best option. And then there's a checkbox down here that says add this data to the data model. Now, again, we're not going to do that in this class, but if you had multiple sheets with multiple sets of data, or even if you had multiple sets of data on a single sheet, I guess, then you can add that data to the data model and analyze it as a whole. So, you know, if you had a sheet of information for each month or something that's formatted the same way, you could add each one of those to the data model, and then you could analyze the whole year's worth of information or whatever. That's pretty cool. But again, it's not something we're set up for on this in this workbook right now, and we have other things to do. So I'm going to leave that alone. I'm going to click OK. And now Excel has taken me to a brand new sheet with some unusual visual changes here. Okay, so let's talk about these. Up at the top, you'll notice I actually have 2 new tabs, the Pivot Table Analyze tab and the design tab right here. Now, in other versions of Excel, it'll be called the Pivot Table Tools Design tab, or the Pivot Table Tools Analyze tab. But in the newer versions of Excel, it's not called that. And so I don't have to say that as often, thank goodness. And so I have whole new tools here. Now, one thing to mention, which I probably said before, but just to kind of be clear on this point, whenever I have extra tabs up here in the ribbon in Excel specifically, or a Microsoft Office product in general, the new tabs, the sort of temporary tabs that are up here, only appear as long as I'm working with some specific object. In this case, it's the pivot table. If I click out of there, you'll notice that those tabs go away. By the way, if you lose that, clicking cell A3 is usually the best way to go in a sheet that's got a pivot table on it. So I'll click on cell A3 to get back there, and now I can see all those tools again. The other thing about those tools to mention and to remind you of is, if you know, assuming that I've said it before, is that the settings that you tweak here are only applicable to in this case, pivot table that you're working with. Whatever the object is that you're working with, these settings are only applicable to that. So if you have another pivot table somewhere else in the workbook, these settings are not going to make any changes to that pivot table, only this one. So just bear that in mind. It's really, it's helpful to just be thinking that way, so that you're not surprised either way. You don't make changes assuming that they'll apply to the other pivot table or pivot tables, and they don't. Or you avoid making changes that you need to make or things like that because you're worried that they're going to apply to one of the other pivot tables. They're not. So let's look at some of these tools up here. Okay, so the slicer and timeline, we unfortunately don't have time to get into, but there's some additional analysis tools that you can use. But let's talk a little bit about these two buttons here. So there's a refresh button. If you change the data that your pivot table is working with, you'll also need to click refresh here in order to update the pivot table itself and the data that it's working with. Because the way pivot tables work, essentially they'll keep a sort of a snapshot of the data that you're working with at the time that you create the pivot table. And so if that snapshot gets, if that snapshot becomes out of date, you got to hit refresh to get a new snapshot. So make sure you do that if you add additional data to your data set or you edit the data. Also, there's this change data source. The other thing to mention about this, if I go back to my order list sheet, if I added, say, 50 additional rows of data here, there were a few more orders that I wasn't aware of at the time I put this sheet together, and so I need to throw that information in there. That's perfectly fine, but the problem with that is if I haven't made my data into a table before I created the pivot table, then every time I add a new row of data or subtract data from it, like delete a few rows or something, I am going to have to change data source here as well and reselect the whole group of cells that I'm working on analyzing. The reason that I always start with a table before I go to a pivot table is precisely for this reason, because when we created the pivot table, we were specifically pointing to, okay, the data's in table 3. If table 3 gets larger or smaller, then Excel is, and your pivot table are automatically going to be taking that into account as soon as you click refresh. When you click refresh, it'll be like, oh, okay, there's 50 new rows in this table. I better add that data in there. But clicking refresh, if you've gone from just a regular range of cells will not do that. It will look at only the data that you had selected or pointed it to when you first created a pivot table and see whether anything has changed in that data. So, so creating it as a table will give you some, it'll just make things easier. It'll cut out some of the steps that you might otherwise need to take. And boy, is that helpful. Okay, so that's why we use a table. Another quick thing to mention, just just as kind of an aside, is whenever you're analyzing your data in a pivot table, you usually want to kind of skim through it a little bit and just look for problems. The biggest problem that you'll sometimes find is empty cells. Empty cells, as humans, we look and there's like a blank cell there and we're like, okay, whatever, that must be 0 or it must not be applicable or whatever. But Excel in working at least in pivot tables doesn't see it that way. If there's an empty cell, it gets all confused. It doesn't have the same amount of data on each row essentially. And so if it's a 0, but you left it as an empty cell, change it to a 0. Don't leave it as an empty cell. If it's something that's not applicable, then it's probably best to put like n/a in the cell or something like that. Something to say like, this one doesn't count, but still have something in that cell. So you'll probably need to kind of look through your data. And of course, in the future, when you're entering data that'll be analyzed by a pivot table, like, oh, I need to make sure I put a 0 here, not just leave it as a blank cell or whatever. But when you're first putting the information into a pivot table, that's something to watch out for. Okay, so let's talk, let's make this happen. So first, I'm going to, let's talk about the #1 rule of pivot tables. The way I like to think of a pivot table, there could be a lot of different ways to think about it. But the way I like to think about a pivot table is that ultimately, at the end of the day, a pivot table is just taking a pile of something and dividing it up into smaller piles. So in this case, it's mostly, for our example here, it's mostly going to be money. Essentially, we're going to take a big pile of money and we're going to divide it up into various sub piles that give us information about how our business is working out, more or less. So let's start with our amount over here. First thing that you want to do when you're creating a pivot table, because it's taking a pile of something and dividing it up into smaller piles, the first thing you want to do when you're setting up a pivot table is you want to take some column or field, as Excel calls them, with a numerical value, and you want to put it in this values area right here in the corner. So I'm going to come up here, hold down with my mouse button on amount in the list of fields, and I'm going to drag it down and drop it in this box underneath where it says values. When I do that, we already have some information from our pivot table. Our pivot table has already told us the total amount of revenue that we brought in with these fake orders. And that total amount of revenue is $100,253,922.80. So it's looking good already. We've learned something and we've had to do very little so far. But of course, we want to divide this up into some piles so that we know what's going on here. Let's talk, or what I'm going to do next is I'm going to find the country field. Now, again, each of these fields corresponds with a column over here on my order list sheet. So, so the amount you'll see is the amount that the customer actually paid, the amount of revenue that came in from that order. And then our, if I go back to my sheet with the pivot table, our country, of course, is the column where it says what country the customer is located in. So I'm going to take the country field and I'm going to drag it down here into the box where it says columns and let go. And that's going to give us some more information. So now, instead of just knowing the grand total of all the revenue we brought in, now we can see, okay, well, there were, we got almost $22 million of revenue from Canada, and about $78 million of revenue from the US. And that added up to this grand total altogether. So that's really handy because we can, because now we know, like, oh, okay, so about a fifth of our business comes from Canada and the other 4/5 come from the US. Great, okay, we've learned something else. So now let's take a look at what happens when we go to our date field here. So I'm going to grab the date field and I'm going to drag it down into the rows area and let go. And you'll notice a few things happen. Now, this is one place where it gets tricky depending on what version of Excel you're using. In older versions of Excel, what would happen is you would get a pretty long list over here. Basically, you would start out, you would have a row for each individual date where an order was placed. One for January 1st and one for January 2nd, assuming that those were both dates that orders were placed, and so on and so forth, until you got to the end. So you would have, essentially, you'd have one, so you'd have one row per option here. But once we go, but now in newer versions of Excel, I'd say probably 2016 onward, it does something more like this. What it did was it kind of grouped up my date data into individual, or into little categories here. So I have years, quarters, and date. You can see this. So what it's actually done, up here at the top, you'll notice I have quarters and years fields now. Those are new. If I look back over at my list of orders, we don't have any quarters and we don't have any years in our columns. But that's okay. We don't need those, because what Excel is doing is it's grouping these together automatically just by looking at where the dates, what the dates are. So what we have is actually 3 different sets of rows now. So the first set of row is the years rows. And so I have a 2018 row and I have a 2019 row. When I hit the plus next to 2018, it expands. And now I get another set of rows, the second set of rows right here, a subset of rows in a way, which is quarters. So first quarter, second quarter, third quarter, fourth quarter. And then if I hit the plus next to one of those, I get January, February, and March. So here's what Excel has done. Because I just had one column with the dates in it, and it's just, if you look at it, it's just like expand that out a little bit. If you look at it, it's just, month/day/year. Because I have that column with, nope, sorry, clicked the wrong thing. Because I have that column with just the dates in it, what it's done is it's grouped those dates up by month. And so the date field here is actually months now. So if I want to see essentially a list of months, then I've got this date field that I can use. Then it created a separate quarters field and a separate years field. If I move the date out here, I'll click and drag it from underneath rows up into the list of fields to get rid of it. You'll now notice I have no plus sign next to these because I only have 2 sets of rows now. I have years rows, and then I have sub rows for each quarter underneath the years. If I click the plus sign for 2019, by the way, I can see those quarters as well. I can also swap these if I want. So if I take this quarters and I drag it above years, so I'll just hold down and drag it up just a smidge. Now I have quarters on top and years on the bottom. What it's going to do is group by quarters. Those become the primary rows. The secondary rows, or sort of the sub rows, are now going to be the years. So for each quarter, I have here's how we did in the first quarter of 2018 in Canada. Here's how we did in the first quarter of 2019 in Canada. So we've got our, so what I'm doing there is I'm able to compare quarters directly from the two different years, or however many years I might have in my data set or whatever. And then you can kind of, I can click the plus, I could see all of the different quarters compared. I can also see totals, which, so for those 2 years combined, the total in quarter 3 for Canada was, excuse me, what was that? $5,338,534.60. So that was my total for the third quarter in 2018 plus the third quarter in 2019. So you can do a lot of stuff to kind of to play around with it. You can sort of, if you switch those fields again, swap that out. If I don't care about quarters, I'll drag quarters up, maybe get date back so I can see the months again. And there we go. So one other thing that I can do, which is probably not terribly useful, but at this point, but I could do it. I can come over here and find a row where I've got one of my month names and right click on it. When I click with the right mouse button, or if you're on a laptop with a touchpad, tap with 2 fingers, that'll work the same way. Or if you have a right mouse button on the touchpad, use that, obviously. I'm going to come down here in the menu and I can click ungroup. When I do that, it actually expands it out so I can see each individual day rather than having it grouped by years and months. That's not terribly useful. So I'm going to come over here, or I'm going to click on one of these dates again, right click on it, click group, and then I'm going to reselect. So I've got, you can filter these dates here. So if I wanted to only see like the 2019 dates or whatever, I could do that. But I'm not going to change these. In this case, I'm just going to have months selected, and then I'll click quarters and years to select those as well. Click OK. And now I've got those fields back the way I want them, kind of the way they were initially. So let's tackle, or let's dig a little further into let's try another setup here. Now I showed you I could filter in that grouping area, but that's not particularly practical. And in fact, that could lead to some confusion potentially. So what I want to do instead, I do want to see the years individually. So I'm going to come down here where I find the years field, and I'm going to drag that up underneath filters and let go. When I do that, I now get up at the very top in cells A1 and B1, I get years, and then it says all in parentheses. If I click the drop down arrow next to that, I can then filter by year. So I've got, let's say I only want to see the 2019 numbers. I'll click 2019 and click OK. If I want to do multiple items, I'll check the box and then check the boxes next to these, click OK. So now it says years 2019, and it shows a little funnel there, which says this is being filtered. And then underneath that, I can see just the dates for, or just the numbers for 2019, nothing else. Okay, somebody said I lost them. So I'll show you again what I just did. Okay, so I have this set up here. So I've got country in the columns area, sum of amount over here under values, and then I had years, quarters, and date underneath the rows area. What I'm going to do is hold down on years and drag it up underneath filters right here and let go. And that turns, basically what that does is it gives me quarters and then underneath that months. By the way, just so that you don't get confused, what I have right now this moment This particular cell that I have selected, B7 right here, this is the total for February in Canada, but it's all February's. Okay, you said you don't have a year's option. So find a date over here, so either a month name or a quarter or whatever. Right click on that, click group, and then make sure months, quarters, and years are all highlighted here at the bottom. And then click OK. And that should do the trick. Then you should have years, quarters, and date over here. Or it might say months, but probably it'll say date. And then, okay, cool. Good. Excellent. So we've got our years up here underneath filters. So I dragged it up underneath filters. And now here in A1 and B1, I've got a drop-down box right here. I'm going to click 2019, click OK. And now what's happened is, rather than both Februarys being added together, I have just the data from 2019 and nothing else. So that's really helpful because I can look at just this year's information. Let's talk about where we are though with this. So I'm going to click on this one right here. How we got to this, or how Excel gets to this, is worth kind of circling back on and kind of focusing on a little bit. So what we've done is we've taken, so we had that 100 million and some odd dollars of total revenue that we brought in over 2018 and 2019 in our example. So what happened, so we had that big old pile of 100 million and some odd dollars. Then we divided it up by countries. So now we have two piles, the US pile and the Canada pile. Then we divided it up by the date. So now when we first put it in there, so once we divided it up by date, we actually had several piles and sort of sub piles. So we had a pile for each year. And then inside of the year pile, we had sort of mini inner piles for each quarter. And then we had sort of sub piles in each quarter pile for each month of the year. And that's the date field. What we've done now by dragging years up here is we've set all the money from other years aside, or well, by putting years here and then setting a filter up at the top so that I chose 2019 rather than all. We've taken all the money that's not from 2019 and pushed that aside and said, I don't even want to look at that right now. I'm just looking at 2019. But then we have each of these little piles here. So we've got our Canada. So this cell that I have selected here is the pile of the money that we brought in May 2019 in the US. So we can get very specific and see exactly where all our numbers are coming from, basically. So what this is, so you can take this and you can tweak it in a lot of different ways. Let's see, let's add another one in here. So I'm going to grab my salesperson field and I'm going to drag that into columns above where it says country. So now it says salesperson and then country. So now what I can see is I can look at the performance of each of my individual salespeople. So Cassius over here has, again, we're looking at only 2019 numbers. In 2019 in Canada, he didn't sell anything in February or March or June or August or October or December or November. He had some sales in the US each month there. And then these are his grand totals for each month of 2019. And then these are the totals for each month in 2019. And then down here, a grand total for 2019. Flannery has been a little more consistent. The only time she didn't sell anything in Canada was just this first, or it was just January. you know, in the US and in Canada, for every month, she had at least something. And so we can kind of go through and see this person by person as well. So we have over here in columns, again, let's look at the structure of this. So we have our big columns, our main columns are the salesperson. You'll notice next to each salesperson's name, there's a little minus sign, where if you click it, you can collapse their column to just show totals and not break it out by country. But as long as I haven't clicked that, then I'll have a sub-column underneath, or I'll have 3 sub-columns underneath Cassius, essentially. Sub-column number 1 is Canada, sub-column number 2 is the US, and sub-column number 3 is the totals. And if I collapse it down, it gives me just totals. So you can play around with this and create a bunch of different structures. You could flip these if you wanted to. So for example, if I could put quarters and date over here in the columns area, and I could put salesperson and country over here. So now I get, now my main columns are first quarter, and then my sub columns are for each month. And then I have a row or a set of rows for each salesperson. So Cassius's totals, and then Cassius's Canada numbers versus Cassius's US numbers. So 3 rows. You could even do, you know, you can even do like a sub row. So if I go state or province, for example, or a sub column, then I can see specifically which states they were selling to. So for each, and provinces, of course. So Cassius now has, so each salesperson has the row with their name on it, the sub row for each country, and then the sub row for each state or province. And we can kind of look and see like where the most, you know, maybe what the most popular states are, like where we do the most business or different things like that. And of course we can swap these too. So we could go, you know, we can change the order of these. So if we are more interested in sort of, so we could do something like this, the country, and then the salesperson, and then the state or province. So we have 2 big rows, one for Canada and one for the US. And then underneath that, we have each salesperson or listed twice. So we've got, we have each person listed under each country. So we have Cassius and then all of his Canada provinces, Delma and all of her Canada provinces, and so on. And then if we go down to the US, we start all over and we have how they did in each state for each salesperson there. So you can do this a ton of different ways. That is really, it's really, really useful because then you're not, because then you can really dig into your numbers and actually analyze them. It's really hard if you just have a list of numbers because, well, really all you can do is look at an individual row or look at a column or maybe sort and say like, okay, well, this person is the number 1 salesperson, or, you know, looks like we did really well in, you know, on this particular day in 2019 or whatever, or maybe you sort it by date and you're like, oh, there are several days in February where we did really well. I wonder what was going on in February or whatever. But at the end of the day, it's really hard to get this level of detail and analysis just doing it based on your, just based on a big list of data. So pivot tables really help you to analyze that. One of the really nice things about it is that you can just play around with this in all sorts of different ways. You're not stuck with any one particular layout. You can just flip it as, you know, flip it around, pivot it as much as you want. And that tends to work really well. One other thing that you can do down here where it says sum of amount, I can make a couple changes down here that will be helpful. If I click on this drop down arrow next to where it says sum of amount, I have value field settings right here. I'm going to click on that. And when I do, it gives me this information or these options right here. So I have, I'm able to rename the field. So that's one thing. I could call it something else altogether. But I can also come down here and choose how it's summarizing. So one thing that I could do would be count rather than sum. If I click on count and click OK, now it changes the name to count of amount. And what I can actually see in here is, for example, looks like in New Brunswick in July 2019, Ray had 2 sales. The count, what it's doing is going through the rows, and rather than taking the numbers and adding them together, it's actually just counting where there's a number or where there's some data in a particular cell versus adding it or doing some other kind of math with it. So in this case, it's just looking and saying, okay, how many orders did they have in a particular, in a particular place at a particular time? And so that can be, we might just get rid of the state and province because that makes it a little more readable here. Yeah, so now now I can see, okay, so looks like, again, Ray had a total of 5 sales in July in the US. So great, okay, that could tell me something potentially. So, so changing how it's calculating these piles basically is really helpful. Again, if you're using my analogy of the sort of pile of money, then you've got the revenue, the money that was paid to you for each order kind of grouped together. And then you're like, okay, we have 5 piles for Ray in July 2019. And so that can, rather than giving you the amounts, that can tell you like how many clients this salesperson is pursuing or things like that, or how many clients they actually buy, I guess. Another thing I can do in this value field settings, I'm going to click on that drop down and click it again. And this time, so I'm going to go back to sum, and I'm also going to click number format right here in the corner. What that's going to do is open up this number or this format cells dialog box. Now, we didn't look at this, but you're actually already familiar with this, with these options from part 1. Back in part 1, we changed the number format of a bunch of cells. We had dates, and we could change them from month/day/year to like, to a long date where it says like, May 26th, 2021 or whatever. Or excuse me, actually Wednesday, May 26th, 2021. So this is the same thing, but this is, if you clicked more formats in this little drop-down box that says general right now, it would get you this same dialog box. So what we're going to do is change the number format a little bit. In this case, I'm going to change it to currency. All that looks good. I'll click OK. I'll make sure that sum is selected here, and then I'll click OK. And now we actually have kind of readable dollar amounts. So rather than having to remember, like figure out where those commas would be and so forth, now I can see at a glance, this is $663,413.40. And, this over here is $3,319,251.40 or whatever. And I don't even have to know that that's a dollar amount. It's like labeled for me. So that's really, really helpful in terms of just readability. Okay, let's go ahead and let's talk a little bit about PivotCharts. So the way that PivotCharts work is they use PivotTable data to make a chart, which is really handy because if I were trying to make a chart out of this information, it'd be too much. These are my individual data points, and I can't represent all of these on a single chart. It would be unwieldy. So what I'm going to do instead, I'm going to come over here. I'm actually going to go ahead and just remove the country just so it doesn't complicate things. So I'm going to drag the country out and drop it in the fields, and we'll get this. So I have each row is a salesperson, and each column, or each sub-column at least, is a month. Somebody has a question. What's up? Oh, okay. Yeah, that's a really good question. If I have a correction, I go to the original table, right? Yeah. If you need to correct the data, you'd go back to the original table, change whatever you wanted to change there, and then click back to sheet 1 or wherever your pivot table is, and click refresh up here. Just the little, preferably just the icon, the little page and the circular arrows. If you click the drop down, you'll have another button in there. Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. So yeah, good clarification there. Okay, so here's my setup just before we make our chart. So we want to make sure, so I've got years under the filters area. I have under columns, I have quarters, and then date, which is my months. Under rows, I have the salesperson. And under sum of amount, and under values, I have sum of amount right here. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to come up and I'm going to click on the insert tab again. And this time I'm going to click the little pivot chart button right here, or I can click the drop down menu and click pivot chart there. And then it's going to give me this same insert chart dialog box that we saw just, or I guess a couple weeks ago when we talked about charts. It's giving me a bunch of different options. So let me look at this. Okay, so we've got, so each group that I have here is, each group of columns that I have here is a salesperson, and then each column individually is a quarter. That's a little weird, but we could potentially sort of reverse that or something. At the stacked column chart, 100% stacked column chart, line chart, pie chart. This could actually be fairly useful. I'm going to go with the pie chart for now. So I'm going to click OK. And now I have, and now what I'm looking at is I've got this is a chart based on my pivot table analysis. So up at the top, I still have my years filter on. If I click on this, then I can change it to a different year if I so choose. I can change, or I can see it's the sum of amount. I've got my quarters. So right now it's showing me, that's a little weird. I wonder why it's doing that. Oh, I see. Okay. It's labeled Q1 January, but it's not actually that. I'm not sure why it's labeled that way. I could come up here, click in this and change it. Again, make sure when you change the title to just sales numbers or something, that you don't press enter once you type it. You just click outside of there. So that way things don't go wrong. But no, maybe it is. How odd. Huh. Okay. That's very weird. Let's add these data labels. Okay, so it is going from, if you look here, when I move my mouse over it, I've got Q1, January, Sadira. So this is right here. Let's see if that matches. Yep. Okay. That's interesting. So not sure why it's keying in on that other than it's the earliest date. So if I deselect everything else, let's see, here we go. All right, and we've got a that's interesting. Okay, well, okay, so I guess you do have to filter it down if you've got too many things here. Let's see. Well, sorry about that. That's a little weird. Let's go ahead. I guess again, with just as it is with the with your sort of with your data set here, you sort of have to filter it down until you get to exactly what you're looking for. In this case, it's just looking at the first row, the first column here. And this might be more useful to if I change the type of chart. So if I go up to design here, change chart type. Yeah, let's try a column 1 now. That makes a little more sense. Okay, cool. We got our, so now we can sort of see like over this quarter, we've got our, that we've filtered things down to, we've got our 3 months. So here's April, here's May, here's June. Excuse me. So again, you kind of want to play around with it until you get it squared away. All right. So, other than that, these pivot charts mostly behave the same as the regular charts that we looked at a couple weeks ago. And we've got one more thing to tackle during this class. So before we dive into our last set of examples, which are a bit of a gear shift, what questions do y'all have? Oh, what kind of chart is this? This is let's see. Which one is that? I believe this is a clustered column chart, but let me double check on that. Yeah, clustered column chart. All right. Cool. Well, let's go ahead and move to the next to the next set of examples here. So we've got this example is going to use two of these. I'm going to click the X to get rid of this. This example is going to use these last two sheets together, the this year sheet and the last year sheet down here. So the this year sheet, the way that this works, so in this example, we've got a kind of a get together with a bunch of different folks who I want to invite to a new get together now that hopefully they're all vaccinated and whatnot for this year. So there's a last year sheet and a this year sheet, and the last year sheet has their old information. I know that, you know, their address, their phone number, their email address, all that stuff hasn't changed. All this stuff is probably not stuff we need. That probably has changed. Hopefully this person's not on an all coffee diet or they won't be joining us this year. You know, they've maintained that for the whole time. What we want to do is basically we want to have on the this year sheet, which is a blank sheet with the same column headings, we want to have the information that is, we want to be able to automatically pull in the information from the last year sheet. So the way this works, we've got our column heading up at the top. And we will do, we've got our column headings up here. What I need to do first, I'm going to come down here to cell A2. Now you'll notice I already turned on data validation, like we talked about in a previous session. I already turned data validation on for column A here. So if I click in a cell in column A and click the drop down arrow next to it, I can select the name of the name of one of the people on the old list here. So I'll select somebody. Okay, great. And now what I'm going to do, and now what I want to happen is I want Excel, when I select a name over here, to automatically fill in that person's address. So to do that, I'm going to use this VLOOKUP function. Now, obviously, in this particular example, it's not as useful because you know, we have such a small data set. But if you have lots and lots of data, then this is going to become really, really helpful. So let's go ahead and, so what we're going to do is we're going to use the VLOOKUP function. So that's all one word, V as in Victor, and then lookup. What it's going to do specifically, let's talk about this before we dive into writing the actual formula. What it's going to do specifically, okay, someone says they don't have the drop downs in column A, right? Let's see. So if that's you, if for some reason you don't see the drop downs when you select a cell in column A, what you'll want to do is select all of column A by clicking the A or kind of the space next to it. Go up to Data tab. Click on the Data Validation button with the little check mark and the cross out thing. Choose List. And then you'll click this little choose list in the drop down here. So click that, choose list. And then down here under source, you click this little arrow to kind of roll up the data validation dialog box. And then click down in the last year sheet and select these cells, A2 to A11 on the last year sheet. Then click the little button again and click OK. And that's going to apply that data validation. Is it working for you okay now? Okay, let's, we'll try it one more time. It's all right, it happens. So, okay, what we'll do is we will head to our, let's see. So we've got our, so we'll select column A. So click the A or the little space next to it. And then once we've got column A selected, we're going to go over here to the, or we'll click on the data tab up at the top. And then come on over and click on the data validation button right here. Now it may or may not say that, but it's got the little check mark and the little like cross out symbol right there. So click on that. Or if you click the little drop down arrow next to it, you can click data validation in that menu. That works as well. Then on this dialog box right here, click under allow, click instead of any value, click on list. Make sure those two boxes are checked. And then under source here, click on that, or click the little arrow next to that, this button right here, and that'll kind of hide it. Then what you need to do, on mine, it automatically jumped over here because I already had the thing set up. But over here where it says, but down here at the bottom, you'll probably need to click the last year sheet. And then come up and select cells A2 to A11. Click the little arrow next to that. And then you should see something like this in the source, and then click OK. And that should apply it. Yay, all right. Wonderful. So from here, so we've got something selected. From here, what we're going to do is we're going to, what we're going to do is we're going to write a version or write a formula that will cause Excel to go and look up the person's address, right? We're going to use the VLOOKUP function, V as in Victor, lookup, all one word. And then here's what we're going to do from there. We've got the address box cell selected, or what we're going to do is we're going to write a formula that's going to look over here in cell A2 and find the name and say, okay, I've got that, Sakiko Herod, here we go. Then it's going to come over here to the last year sheet and it's going to look for a match for that. And it'll find it here, Sakiko Herod. Okay, I got it. Then we're going to tell it where on this row it should look for the information that we need. So in this case, it's going to look here in column B. So it'll find that and say, oh, okay, I'm looking over here in this column. They want this information. And it's going to get that 7356 Blue Sky Pike. And it's going to come back here and fill that in this cell. Great. So let's write that formula. What I'm going to do is come up here to select cell B2, come up here to the top and click in the formula box, hit my equal sign to tell Excel to expect a formula, and then type in VLOOKUP, all one word, VLOOKUP. Open a set of parentheses, and then I have several options here. Or then I have kind of my hint system, which tells me the arguments that I need. Now, again, anytime you use these functions, these sort of preset options that Excel allows you to use, anytime you use those, anytime you use one of those functions in a formula, Excel, that function needs specific information in order to do its job. And those specific pieces of information that it needs are known as arguments. So this particular function calls for 4 arguments: lookup value, table array, column index number, and then range lookup, which is an optional argument. We're gonna talk about each of those in turn. So the first argument is lookup value. So that's going to be the thing that it's looking for a match for over on the other sheet. And obviously that's going to be in cell A2. We can see it's color coded here. So we'll just put A2. There's the color coding. I'll put a comma after that A2. And then we get our table array. Our table array is going to be the set of cells that our audience is going to look in to determine our list of cells that the audience is going to look in, or that our formula is going to look in to find that match, to find, in this case, the name Sakiko Herod. So the table array, that is going to be over here on the last year sheet. So here's kind of a shortcut way that you can do this. While I'm still editing my formula, I've got my cursor blinking up here at the top. While I'm still editing my formula, I'm going to come down here and click on the last year sheet. When I click on that, you'll notice it actually fills in apostrophe, last year, apostrophe, exclamation point. So what that tells Excel is this is the name of a sheet. And all of this in between the apostrophes is the name of a sheet. With the exclamation point. Now, if it was last year, all one word, or if it was another single word or whatever, then I wouldn't need the apostrophes. I could just type the name of the sheet and add an exclamation point. But the apostrophes tell it, even though there's a space in here, all of this is the name of the sheet. So it's already filled that in for me. And now I can actually take my mouse and I can drag over from cells A2 to D11, just like we did earlier when we were defining that whatchamacallit, the data validation. Okay, we've got that all selected. Now I'm going to put a comma after that. And we're being prompted for our column index number. And this is where it gets a little weird. So you want to be careful with this. So our column index number is going to be it's kind of an unusual thing. When I look at my table array, in other words, the existing data that Excel is looking for a match in, it's a range of cells. So it's a range of cells from A2 to D11. And the way that the column index number works is it starts from the leftmost column in the data set, wherever that is. Doesn't matter whether it's column A or column X. It starts with the column on the far left of my data set, and then it counts over the number that I put in the column index number. So in this case, so if I put 1 here, it's going to look, or it's going to be getting the information from column A in this case. But if I put B or 2, it's going to get the information from column B. If I put 3, it's going to get the information from column C, and so on and so forth. But it's not, in this case, it's not going to, but if all of this data were moved over several rows, my column index number would still be the same. The information I want is in the second column from the left, which is the address. And so I'm going to put 2 in here. That's my column index number. And then finally, so I'll put a comma after that. And finally, my last argument that I'm being prompted for is the range lookup option. And I can either put true or false here. True will allow Excel to look for an approximate match. So if I had, instead of Sakiko Herod, if I had someone named Sakiko Hiro, then it might settle for that one or something. Or if the name was slightly misspelled in some other way. So that would be an approximate match. An exact match, though, is going to say if there's 2 spaces in between Sakiko and Herod, or if there's an A instead of an O here or something, no dice. There's no match here. And to me, that's the preferred way to go. So I almost always use false when I'm doing this. The reason for that is Excel, in my experience, is not super duper great at judging what's an exact match and what's an approximate match. And whatever it finds, whatever it finds at the top that it considers to be an approximate match, it will go for that, even if there's an exact match further down. So, so that to me indicates that an exact match is the preferred way to go. Plus, we use data validation. So there's literally no way we could have an approximate match. We would either have an exact match or it wouldn't match at all. So I always put false here. And then I'm going to close my parentheses. Of course, you can't have a left parenthesis without a right one. Press enter on my keyboard. And it takes me back to the this year sheet. And sure enough, 7356 Blue Sky Pike. We got it. So again, just to recap what this formula did. This formula looked at cell A2 and it said, okay, Sakiko Herod, got it. Then it said, I need to look for a match to this. Where do I go? And I told it, okay, you need to go to the last year sheet and you need to look at cells A2 to D11. And then, and that will, you can find a match there, hopefully. Goes, okay, so it goes over to the last year sheet. And then it says, oh, found it, here it is. And then it looks at my column index number and says, okay, they want the information that's in the second column from the left in my in the table array. So 1, 2, okay, got it. And then it brings it back and it puts it right here. So that's how the VLOOKUP function works. So let me go ahead. I'm gonna drag this down a little bit, drag the little dot to autofill. You'll notice I get NA because there's nothing to match over here in the rest of column A so far. I'm going to come down a little ways. I'm going to click on the drop-down menu and I'm going to select somebody's name. But I'm still getting NA. So we have a problem. Whoopsie. And when you look at the formula, you can see what the problem is. So VLOOKUP and then A19. So far, so good. Last year. Yep. It's on the last year sheet. And then it says A19 to D28. That's my lookup value, or that's my table array according to this version of the formula. When I go over there and find A19 to D28, that is this range of cells. And of course, it's completely empty. So obviously, we have our same problem that we had back when we talked about absolutes. I could make this an absolute reference. So I could put a $sign in front of the A, a $sign in front of the 2, a $sign in front of the D, a $sign in front of the 11, and make that work. But what I prefer to do, again, is to use names so that my formula gets a little bit more readable. What I'm going to do is click the last year sheet again. And this time I'm going to go for, this time I'm going to select this whole table array. So A2 to D11. I'm going to come up here to the top where it says A2, and I'm going to name this range old info. So I'll type that in and press enter on my keyboard. And there we have it. Now, when I go to the this year sheet, again, I'll go back to cell A2 and all of this stuff. So I have A2, comma, I'll delete all of that. And now I've just got A2, comma, and then a comma, and I'm going to type old info into my formula right there. Table, or my column index number is still 2. This is still set as false, and that's still A2. If I hit the check mark, this still works. Double click the dot, autofill this down. I now get 123 Fake Street. Okay, great. Any of these, I can select a person and it'll grab their address. However, there's still kind of a problem with this formula. If I copy it over here into column C, I get in A again. So now what's happening is, you'll notice I got B2 here, and I've got column index number 2. So what it's doing is it's looking over here where the address is, and it's finding a match to the address. And then it's looking at my column index number and saying 2. Well, this is the second column from the left. So wait, this is the same information. And so it's getting confused. So what we need to do is one more thing to make this formula work. Well, 2 more things, I guess, to make this formula work exactly the way we intend it to. One is to add a $sign in front of the A. So we'll make that one absolute. That makes the column letter absolute, but the row number relative. It can change. So I'll drag this back down and all that still works. It's looking good. And then I can drag this over and I get, well, I still get the address. So I still have a problem. And that problem is, of course, my column index number up here is still 2. Just need to backspace that and change it to 3. So now this version of the formula is looking back at column A2 rather than at B2. And once it finds a match for the name, it's counting over 1, 2, 3 on the other sheet and finding the phone number in that column there. Drag it over one more time to email. It's still giving me the phone number, but I just, again, need to change my column index number to 4. And there we have it. And now I can actually select these 3 cells and I can drag down to autofill all of these cells. And any of these where I select a person, it will find their information. And then I can fill in this stuff separately. If I wanted to get a little fancier with it, I could wrap this in an if function like we talked about last week with logical functions, and have it essentially check for errors. There's actually a formula, or there's a function called if in A right here. And so I could have it check to make sure it's not bringing back a in A or not applicable before it runs the rest of the formula. But we don't have time for that. Just know that that's an option. There's also an if error in there as well. And that is pretty much it. What questions do y'all have for me before we wrap it up? All right. Well, thank you all so much for joining me. I hope that you have a fantastic rest of the day. You know, shoot me any questions you have via email, digital@cals.org. Well, thanks for sticking with it. I hope you have a great one. Bye now.